Welcome to Crime and Sacrifice. I'm your host, Brianna, and this is episode 10, Deanne, Kilian. In the early 1900s, America was a different place. The entire world was different, less connected globally, but maybe more connected in terms of your individual community. A lot of people say that daily life was simpler. Of course, we didn't live with the constant threat of giant, looming problems like climate change, didn't yet have the experience of the power of human destruction, the threat of world wars, the fear that humanity had the tools to destroy our entire world beyond repair with the advent of nuclear weapons. Of course, these things were just on the horizon, but maybe it felt simpler because there wasn't that looming, overwhelming threat. Despite how different the world was, I have no doubt that people were people, with many of the same concerns, looking for love, hoping for a community, a way to care for their families, and for a better future. The country was also more rural then, and many people lived and worked in the country as farmers. William Bayless was one of these people, living and working outside of Dodge City in Kansas. He was a young man, single and filled with ambition, looking to prove himself and to build a life. One morning in 1909, William was recovering from whooping cough, an illness that involves high fever, congestion, whole body fatigue, and of course, a signature cough. But his profession was that of a farmer, and William forced himself to get up and get to work that day, where he worked with several other local farmers. Later that day, 2 farmers descended to the bottom of a well on the property to do some work. However, I guess as can happen when you're digging underground, sometimes there are pockets of toxic gas, which was the case in this well. The 2 were quickly engulfed in the toxic fumes, and it wasn't long before both men were unconscious at the bottom of this 45-foot well, far from safety and fresh air. William was off at a distance, but he noticed commotion around the mouth of this well and ran over to see what was going on. Another farmer named Clarence Thompson had already volunteered to be lowered down into the well after the 2 to try to save them. Now, this was over 100 years ago, so it's a little unclear from historical accounts, but I believe one of the men was a relative of Clarence's. Their names were Eugene Davis, 29 years old, and Nelson Thompson, just 24. No matter what, it's clear that Clarence cared about them, as he risked his own life to try to save them. The farmers above ground secured Clarence to a rope and lowered him the 10, 20, 30, 45 feet to the bottom. Both farmers were completely unresponsive when Clarence got to them. He secured the first man and instructed the team above to lift him to safety. He soon recognized the danger to himself, though, as he felt lightheaded and knew that he too might pass out soon. But when the rope was lowered again, he would not leave the other farmer down at the bottom of that well, and secured the second man, instructing the team above to pull him again while Clarence waited in the fume-filled well. William, who we talked about before, was part of the team above ground, helping to pull the men out of the well, and yelled out to Clarence after they got the other man to safety that the rope was coming down for him next. To his dismay, they didn't get a response from Clarence. It became clear that he was overcome by the toxic gas. William wouldn't let his friend die alone at the bottom of the well. He saw firsthand the danger that awaited him in this fast-acting toxic gas, but despite this, he thought he could do it and instructed the team to lower him now to the bottom of the well. He noted that Clarence was completely unconscious. He tied him securely to the rope just as Clarence had done for the others, before yelling for the team above to pull Clarence to safety. Dazed, feeling the power of the toxic fumes for himself, William's mind grew foggy as he struggled to stay awake. It seemed ages before he heard the shouts above and saw the rope lowering once more toward him. He was able to grasp it firmly enough to be lifted to safety. Just seconds longer, and he would have passed out and succumbed to the fumes like every man before him. Sadly, the first 2 men to pass out at the bottom of the well, Eugene and Nelson, were there for too long. They died. However, William successfully saved Clarence's life, and the two of them made a full recovery. The other farmers on scene that day recognized the heroism and selflessness of both men, and they wanted some way to be able to recognize this. It was just 5 years after the Carnegie Hero Fund had been established by Andrew Carnegie, maybe one of the greatest philanthropists in American history. The event that had caused Carnegie to create this award was a coal mining explosion that happened in 1904 at the Harwick mine, that ultimately claimed 181 lives and had a profound impact on Andrew Carnegie. Specifically, it was the actions of two brave individuals who came to the Harwick mine after the explosion in an attempt to save the others trapped below ground and entered at great peril to themselves to attempt a rescue. Their names were Selwyn Taylor and Daniel Lyle. Adolph Gunya was the sole survivor of the explosion and was brought to safety under Selwyn's efforts, though both Selwyn and Daniel ultimately died in their attempts to save others at the mine. Seeing their bravery, Carnegie wanted some public way to thank them and to ensure that their family didn't suffer financially from the loss of their loved ones. In 1904, he established this award to encourage and reward those who have knowingly put their lives in danger in order to save or attempt to save other people. Awardees would receive a medal and public recognition for their actions, along with access to scholarships, grants, death benefits, and other forms of financial aid as needed. According to the Carnegie Hero Fund website, any candidate considered for the award must be a civilian who voluntarily risks his or her life to an extraordinary degree while saving or attempting to save the life of another person. The award is determined by a 21-member committee. Since its inception in 1904, more than 10,000 awards have been given from a nominated pool of 90,000 people, with approximately 25% of those awarded dying during this act of heroism, awarded to them posthumously. At the time of this incident, the award was still relatively new, though it was well known enough, and the other farmers on scene were so moved by the actions of William and Clarence that both were nominated. Both were awarded Carnegie Medals for their actions. Family legend has it that it was because of this public recognition that William was able to woo his future wife. They married within a year, and William went on to have a long and beautiful life, ultimately having 8 kids and many grandchildren and living until 1962. The Carnegie Medal he won became something of a family heirloom, passed on first to his daughter Marie, who then gave it to her nephew Duane before she died. The family likely thought this would be the end of the story, a history that they were proud of to pass on to younger members of the family. But in 2018, 109 years after William Bayliss was awarded the Carnegie Medal, Duane's older sister Deanne Kilian would find herself accepting a Carnegie Medal of her own because of her heroic actions when the life of a coworker was on the line. Deanne was 62 years old, a pediatric nurse practitioner working at Munson Army Health Center, a military medical facility in Leavenworth, Kansas, with a staff that was a mixture of enlisted medical personnel and civilian employees. Deanne herself was a civilian employee at the center. Another civilian employee of the facility at the time was 54-year-old Clifford Curry, who worked as a social services assistant in the pediatric wing close to Deanne. Clifford hadn't been working at the facility long, and his performance was slipping, or, in truth, it had never really been exemplary. He was a big man, around 200 pounds, though he was only 5 foot 8 inches tall. He had short shaved hair on the top of his head and a big bushy beard that had gone mostly gray. His job at the facility was to work on the administrative side of things, completing paperwork, keeping track of documents, and dealing face-to-face with many of the child patients of the facility and their families. Because his job required a fair amount of patient interaction, his bedside manner was important, but of course, so too was his ability to keep accurate records and to ensure that his job responsibilities were being completed each day. But Clifford seemed to struggle with both of these things. He routinely had complaints lodged against him, sometimes by patients and a few times by coworkers. His job performance was poor, several patients complained about his behavior toward them, and he was outright negligent in certain duties of the job that he just failed to do. His supervisor at the center was Katie Blanchard, a clinical nursing supervisor and Army nurse with a rank of first lieutenant. Katie was in her mid-20s and came from a military background, having 2 parents who served. In fact, the military was her life, and she ended up marrying another service member, Troy Hawkinson. The 2 of them had 2 young sons together when Katie and Clifford first began working together at the medical center. Katie was described as a very positive person with a strong desire to help her patients. She was bright, cheerful, and intelligent, and despite working in a field that can be stressful and that requires you to witness some patients and families at the worst times of their lives, Katie really cared, something that showed and meant a great deal to her patients and coworkers. Even before her time at Munson, classmates remembered Katie as someone who was very funny and authentic, and it seems that she took this humor and deep-rooted desire to help with her to her work. And despite being a young woman and standing only 5 feet 4 inches tall, Katie was no pushover. She believed in the protocol and discipline that made the military work. So when Clifford, a member of her team that reported directly to her, was failing, she did what she could to help, offering constructive criticism of his work in an effort to see his performance improve. In one of the first incidents that indicated that something was seriously wrong, Katie took Clifford aside for a private meeting in his office to discuss a program he was managing and why it had received a failing grade, what they could do to improve it. Almost as soon as the conversation began, Katie was shocked as Clifford became almost immediately defensive and full of some kind of rage. He raised his voice, became belligerent and aggressive, and told Katie to, quote, "Get the fuck away." Sensing a physical threat, Katie told Clifford that if he didn't calm down, she would be forced to call a code green, which essentially alerts security to remove a potentially dangerous person from the facility. She then removed herself from the situation, shaken by the entire exchange. Clifford slammed the door behind her, and Katie realized the gravity of the situation. Believing in the chain of command, Katie's next step was to report Clifford's behavior, which seemed to her to be unhinged and unprovoked for something as simple as a review of his performance. She went to her supervisor to report Clifford's behavior and to recommend 7-day suspension to ensure that Clifford knew that threatening and insubordinate behavior would not be tolerated. She also documented what happened with the hospital's HR department. However, Clifford denied everything that Katie said and lodged his own complaints about her. In fact, he even wrote a letter which stated, "Each and every day she addresses me in her condescending tone. And with her up in my personal space-face attitude, I feel intimidated, emotionally distraught, nervous, and anxious. Because of her continued mistreatment of me, I have had to seek professional counseling and have had to get on medication." With his counter-accusations, it became something of a he said, she said situation, and Katie's supervisor decided that he didn't want to stir things up further and declined to discipline Clifford. This might have made more sense if Clifford hadn't already had a record of making other coworkers and even patients uncomfortable. If Katie wasn't such an exemplary officer. But Katie accepted this decision and moved on. However, she couldn't forget the rage she had seen in Clifford's eyes and the flicker of what he might be capable of, and from that day forward, she, at the recommendation of her supervisor, insisted on having another person with her whenever she went to speak with Clifford in the future. Things continued without any major incident for a while, and Katie was soon out on maternity leave. She gave birth to her 3rd son and took some time off before returning to work refreshed, intent on dealing with this situation with Clifford in the most professional way possible. It was still Katie's responsibility to supervise Clifford, and she refused to be intimidated into allowing his poor performance to be ignored. She continued to try to address problems when they came up, and this time always made sure to have a coworker with her when she needed to speak to Clifford about ways to improve his performance. But with the lack of any disciplinary action for his previous outburst, it seemed like Clifford was actually emboldened to act even more aggressively than before. Katie would try to bring up issues, and Clifford would either ignore her, act without respect, or actually blow up in anger, shouting and yelling threats. He even began to feel comfortable enough to complain about Katie openly to their coworkers, disparaging her for being a woman and mocking her for trying to have a family and a career. He told coworkers that he was going to teach her a lesson. Dangerous words to hear from a coworker, and if you go to our website at crimeandsacrifice.com, we do have some resources for how you can help if you find yourself in a similar situation, either receiving this kind of abuse at work or even just hearing it. It wasn't just Katie that Clifford had issues with. Others were hesitant to work with him at all. He had outbursts of rage, swearing, so much so that people generally avoided him. When he spoke to other people, he avoided eye contact and seemed increasingly agitated. From January to September of 2016, she actually had to follow through and call a code green on Clifford multiple times. His behavior became that threatening. On one occasion, Clifford saw Katie writing out some paperwork and may have assumed it was some kind of report about him, at which time he cornered her and began yelling in her face, swearing at her. After this particular outburst, Katie was so shaken up that she actually had to leave the hospital for the day. But still, Katie's chain of command in the military refused to act and refused to remove or even discipline Clifford, despite the fact that this behavior had now been witnessed by many of Katie's coworkers. She tried multiple times to flag Clifford as a threat, continuing to go to her supervisor. The message that Katie was ultimately given was to come to the military chain of command with facts and not emotions. That's exactly what she had been doing. She had courage and was not one to shrink away from her own duties, even if her superior officers refused to help. So Katie continued performing the duties of her job, careful to document the incidents with Clifford as soon as they happened, and always making sure to have another employee of the hospital there whenever she had to speak with Clifford. Things had been going on for more than 13 months when September of 2016 rolled around. In that time frame, Katie had filed more than 20 negative counseling statements about Clifford and his increasingly hostile behavior and poor performance. But strangely, things did seem to improve. Clifford, who had had difficulty interacting with people, began greeting people in the hallway and seemed almost cheerful. On September 6, 2018, Clifford sent himself an email that said the following: "I don't think she has your best interests in mind. She is vindictive enough to try to sabotage you because she is trying to lay in wait and get the position herself. We'll do anything necessary to prevent you from keeping your job." On September 7th, Katie once again found herself in the uncomfortable position of needing to address Clifford's performance problems. But she did what needed to be done. She found a coworker to stay in her office with them and asked Clifford to come by to discuss. As was her responsibility, she let Clifford know there were mistakes in one of his recent reports, though it was unclear if what she was saying was getting through to him. She asked him point blank, "Do you understand the problem?" To which Clifford replied, simply and with great underlying rage, "Yes. You are the problem." When she was finished and Clifford was on his way out, he asked Katie to stop by his office later to discuss something else. Something about the way he said it made her immediately uncomfortable and suspicious, especially since Clifford very often was protective of his space and never wanted Katie in his office. Feeling unsafe, Katie declined, but Clifford remained in her office with something of a wild look in his eyes. And Katie sensed a coming threat or outburst and reminded Clifford that she would call a code green again if she needed to. Clifford left and the day continued, tense, but not so different than others before. At 5 p.m., Clifford was strangely still lingering around his office. Normally, he was already gone by then. Something about his behavior had been off all day. Katie went back to her own office to wrap up for the day. She gathered her things and was texting her husband to let him know that she'd be heading home soon, when she noticed a figure in her peripheral vision standing in her doorway. It was Clifford, a water bottle filled with some clear brown liquid in his hands, a cold look in his eyes. Before she could react, Clifford closed in on her with purpose, emptying the contents of the bottle on Katie. The room was filled suddenly with the scent of gasoline, and Katie tried to work herself out of shock, to say or do something to stop him. She was thinking she would try to run past him as Clifford took out a patch of matches from his pocket, lit one, and threw it on her, setting Katie ablaze. She could feel searing heat across her neck, face, and chest, where the accelerant was concentrated. Deanne Kilian, the nurse working at the facility that we spoke about at the beginning of the episode, whose grandfather had received the Carnegie Medal for bravery in saving a fellow farmer's life over 100 years before, had also stayed a little later that day to go over some patient charts. At some point, she heard voices, then some strange, muffled cries from the office next door. Katie's office. This was weird because the facility was usually quiet at that hour, and Deanne could sense that maybe something was wrong. She left her office to investigate and saw Clifford hovering in the doorway. Walking up, she could smell gasoline and could hear Katie yelling, "Help me." Soon was horrified to see that Katie was on fire from the waist up. Without contemplating the danger at all, Deanne pushed past Clifford, wondering why he wasn't helping her, but her mind quickly switched over to the fact that they needed to act fast. She noticed him opening a razor that was in his hands, but didn't even have time to consider what this might mean. There was nothing in the room that would obviously help her put out the flames, so despite the danger and imminent harm to herself, Deanne tried desperately to smother the flames with her own hands and arms, trying to wipe off the accelerant from Katie's torso, suffering severe burns on her hands and arms in the process. She then tried to get Katie's uniform off, to remove some of the accelerant and possibly use that to smother the flames, but the zipper was already melted shut at this point. Another coworker nearby, Dr. Adela Ganasias, also heard the commotion and came running. Diane yelled for her to find a blanket or something more effective to smother the flames as she led Katie into the hallway. Dr. Ganasias found one, and the two of them wasted no time in throwing the blanket over their friend and gently laying her on the floor. Deanne thought the worst of the danger had passed, but then she saw Clifford standing there again. But still, something didn't compute in her mind, and she was in nurse mode, trying to assess Katie to make her safe. Deanne asked Dr. Ganasias to call 911, and the doctor left to make that call. As she was attending to her patient, a moment later, Deanne could feel Clifford's presence looming behind her. Suddenly, Clifford began violently attacking, kicking with his legs in order to inflict even more violence to Katie, whose clothing and skin was still smoking from the flames. It was then that the reality of the situation became clear. Deanne's only instinct was to protect Katie at all costs, to put herself between Clifford and his target. He began to kick Diane in the back as he tried to reach out and slash at Katie with the straight razor. Deanne physically laid herself on top of Katie just as Dr. Ganasias was returning. But Clifford was relentless in trying to stab or cut Katie while she was on the floor and anybody else that got in his way, and he was now brandishing a large pair of scissors in one hand. Dr. Ganasias and Deanne both attempted to stop his attacks or subdue him, and Katie herself fought back. But Clifford was a big man, succeeding in getting several slashes on target and on Deanne's arms. He then moved to Katie's other side and stomped with his foot as hard as he could onto her neck, attempting to break it. Katie looked up into Clifford's eyes during the attack, and what she saw was a kind of half smirk as he looked at what he had done and tried desperately to finish the job. He was mumbling unintelligibly throughout. But Deanne grabbed one of Clifford's outstretched legs and pulled with all of her strength, wrestling Clifford to the ground and shattering her own leg in the violent struggle that ensued. Thankfully, it was at that moment that help arrived in the form of Sergeant Jeremy Dolan, who was able to safely subdue Clifford, remove the weapons from his hands, and restrain him. He brought Clifford to another room as Deanne and Dr. Ganasias went back to trying to treat Katie, whose situation was becoming more and more dire, her whole face and upper body covered with blood. Katie was still conscious at this point and said repeatedly, "I told you this would happen." She had. She had done everything right and had repeatedly flagged Clifford's behavior, and nothing had been done. The entire attack lasted 15 minutes. Firefighters soon arrived on scene. When one of the firefighters said into his radio that it was a possible chemical burn, a still very lucid Clifford said, "It's gasoline, you idiot," from the adjoining room where he was being held. Katie and Deanne were soon taken for treatment while the FBI came to collect evidence, noting the matches in Clifford's pockets and the burns on his own hands. As he was being led away in police custody, Clifford Curry told everybody that would listen that he was not well, that he needed psychiatric help and a lawyer. Besides some surface wounds and scratches, Dr. Ganasias and Sergeant Jeremy Dolan were not seriously harmed in the struggle. Deanne was treated for a fractured leg and severe burns to her arms and hands. She went on to make a complete and full recovery from the physical wounds, though she would live with nightmares of the attack and PTSD symptoms for years to come. Katie's road to recovery was more difficult. She had suffered 3rd and 4th degree burns on 20% of her body, including the right side of her face, her neck, chest, arms, and hands. She was in a coma immediately following the attack, and pictures of her early recovery show an unrecognizable Katie, her face swollen and burned. When she was just beginning to wake up, she could feel the love of her family, her parents, siblings, husband, and boys. And she knew that they were there with her, that because she had their love and support, that she would be okay, that this wouldn't break her in the end. She ended up spending 42 days in the hospital, suffering lasting burns and scar tissue on a large portion of her face and upper body, losing her right ear completely, and to date has undergone over 100 surgeries and skin grafts. And though she will always carry the visible scars from that day, today she is recognizable as the same Katie, the same beautiful woman before the attack and afterward. One can only imagine the pain of so many surgeries, the sensitivity of the grafted and scarred skin. She also still has surgeries on her mouth every few months and has had to work with a speech pathologist for hundreds of hours due to the burns on the sides of her mouth that make it difficult for her to speak. In the months and years since, she's reported that a lot of people see her and think, not too bad, you still look great, which may be true, but there really is no part of her body that is not scarred, with all of the skin grafts taken from areas that weren't touched by the flames. Her skin is stretched, and it makes it feel like there are ropes pulling her skin taut. It's difficult lifting things. It's hard for her to be in the sun. Just going outside can make those areas of grafted skin inflamed and painful if she's out for too long. Despite her painful recovery and undergoing such a horrific and entirely preventable ordeal, Katie has turned her anger into resolve to do even more good in this world, and her innate desire to help others has only grown. She has become a public speaker and advocate for preventing workplace violence, creating videos for public awareness, speaking at events, and going on talk shows to share her story. In 2018, Katie enrolled in a master's program in nursing education with a focus in workplace violence prevention. In Katie's own words, "The attack that was meant to kill me only made me stronger and more determined. I find peace in the hope that the work I do will prevent violence and make the workplace safer for everyone." Immediately following the attack, Katie had no legal recourse to go after the superior officers who were negligent and continued to put her in danger because of the rules of the military and something called the Ferris Doctrine, which was designed to prevent legal liability from poor decisions in wartime. But the poor decisions made in Katie's case weren't made during the pressures of war. They were made in an otherwise unremarkable hospital setting, and seem to have been made due to some amount of bias or prejudice at Katie as a female officer. Not only this, but despite having health care as an officer, there are some real and constant medical costs for something like this. Every procedure is a battle to get approved. She has also had to fight for some pain management services in her recovery, and to be granted money for PTSD treatment and counseling. She has recently fought to try to change legislation around the potentially problematic Ferris Doctrine. After the attack, First Lieutenant Katie Blanchard was promoted to captain and transferred to Joint Base Lewis McChord to help her with recovery, which has included rehabilitative and vocational resources to help her get back to living and working normally again, a space that is reserved for wounded soldiers. Her husband is still an active duty officer. In response to this incident, the Army has instated a committee to educate and help introduce workplace violence policies, and Katie has been asked to be a part of it. Katie hopes to be honorably discharged so she can work in the private sector as a nurse. Deanne Kilian was awarded the Secretary of the Army Award for Valor in March of 2017 for her actions, along with 2 others who intervened that day, including Dr. Adela Ganasias and Sergeant Jeremy Dolan, who helped to subdue Clifford, was presented the Soldier's Medal. When she heard that she had also been nominated for the Carnegie Medal, Deanne remembered that her grandfather had won that award and thought, it'd be kind of cool if I won one too. Deanne says that she just did what she needed to do at the time. But to be able to make a difference in someone's life, that was really humbling for her. In 2018, Deanne found out that she did, in fact, win the Carnegie Medal. During the ceremony, her award was presented by retired Brigadier General Jeffrey Johnson of the U.S. Army Regional Health Command. Katie Blanchard came to the ceremony, of course, saying that she was touched that Deanne was honored in that way. It's one thing to be a hero to one person, but it's another to be distinguished and to have a community come around you and say, that's what bravery looks like. Of course, Deanne remains very humble, saying, I just thank God that I was in the right place at the right time to make a difference in her life. Deanne has also said that she is still in the process of healing, dealing still with PTSD symptoms and the physical pain of recovering. As for Clifford Curry, he went to trial for assault with the intent to commit murder. In addition to the overwhelming physical evidence on scene and the eyewitness testimony, the FBI pulled the following search history off his phone. He searched for, how long would it take to die if one of your external jugular veins was slit? Again, you can see what was on his mind, and that this crime was obviously premeditated. Clifford was ultimately convicted and sentenced to up to 20 years in prison. He was also ordered to pay $3.5 million in restitution, the amount that the judge deemed necessary for Katie's pain and suffering. Katie, in her victim impact statement, said that she wakes up in terror that she's on fire again, but she is a survivor and is not just going to curl up. Clifford Curry declined to comment. After the sentence, Katie stated, 20 years doesn't feel like justice. He not only tried to kill me, but gave me injuries I will have for the rest of my life. Clifford appealed his conviction, saying the prosecutor made improper statements to the members of the jury. While the 10th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals agreed that there were some improper statements made, they said that this didn't amount to any violation of Curry's right to a fair trial. Clifford Curry is still behind bars. Deanne and Katie are still out there making a difference. That's it for this week. Be sure to check out our website at crimeandsacrifice.com if you want to see the show notes for this and all of our episodes. And if you have a chance to rate and review the show, it would mean a lot. Thanks so much for listening. What kind of person will you choose to be?